My lazy son dropped out of college and declared I must still pay his rent, saying, "You're my parent, that's your job." When I refused, he sneered, "Fine, I'll just stay here forever." The next week, he came home to find his bags packed and the locks changed. He screamed outside, but I just smiled from the window and whispered, "Time to get a job." I never thought I'd be the kind of parent who had to kick their own kid out, but here we are. For context, I'm a 52-year-old single dad. My son, Kyle, is 22. I raised him alone after his mother walked out when he was 6. I worked hard to make sure he had a good life. I gave him everything I could, maybe too much. Somewhere along the way, he got it in his head that life was supposed to be easy, that things would always be handed to him. I ignored the signs for too long. In high school, he slacked off, but his grades were just good enough to scrape by. He refused to get a part-time job, saying school was stressful enough. I let it slide because I wanted him to focus on his future. He got into college, and I was relieved. I thought this was his chance to mature. I paid his tuition, his rent, his groceries, everything. The deal was simple: go to school, get good grades, and eventually, become independent. But that's not what happened. One day, Kyle came home and casually announced, "I'm done with school. College isn't for me." I was stunned. I asked him what his plan was. He shrugged. "Dunno. Maybe I'll just take some time to figure things out." I told him that was fine, but if he wasn't in school, he needed a job. His response: "I'll think about it." That was the first red flag. The second came a week later when I asked if he had applied anywhere. "Why would I work when you can just cover my bills?" I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Kyle looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You're my parent. That's your job." I asked him what exactly he thought my job was. "Taking care of me. You make enough money. It's not like you can't afford it." I felt something snap inside me. I told him I was done. No job, no free ride. He had a month to start contributing to rent, or he was out. He smirked. "Fine. I'll just stay here forever then." He said it so confidently, like he had me cornered. Like I had no choice but to let him live off me for as long as he wanted. He had no idea what was coming. I spent the next few days making arrangements. First, I called my landlord. Since Kyle wasn't on the lease, I had every right to change the locks. The landlord was fully on board. Then, I started packing his things. I didn't touch anything valuable, I wasn't being cruel, but I made sure that when he left the house, he'd come back to everything packed and waiting for him. The night before I put my plan into action, I asked him one last time, "Are you going to start working?" He barely looked up from his phone. "I told you. I'm figuring it out." I nodded. That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, Kyle left to hang out with his friends. The second he was gone, I changed the locks. I moved all his bags to the front porch and left a note on top. It read, "Time to get a job." That night, he came back and found himself locked out. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He tried his key. Nothing. He tried again, jiggling the handle. Then he saw his bags. I watched from the living room window as realization set in. He pounded on the door. "Dad! Open the door." I didn't move. "What the F***, Dad? Let me in." I walked to the window, made eye contact, and shook my head. "Time to get a job," I said, just loud enough for him to hear. He lost it. Screaming, swearing, calling me every name he could think of. He even kicked the door once, but I knew he wouldn't actually break it, he wasn't that stupid. For nearly an hour, he stood outside, alternating between rage and fake remorse. First, he was furious. Then, he was begging. Then, he was threatening to call the cops, which was hilarious, because what exactly would he report? My dad kicked me out for being lazy. Eventually, he stopped. He grabbed his bags, got into his car, and drove off. I sighed and sat down. The house was finally quiet. But I knew this wasn't over yet. I knew Kyle wouldn't just accept this. He had never faced real consequences before, and I doubted he'd start taking responsibility overnight. For the next few days, my phone blew up. Calls, texts, voicemails, each one angrier than the last. First, he tried guilt-tripping me. "Dad, I can't believe you do this to your own son. Do you even love me? Then came the threats. If you don't let me back in, I'll never speak to you again. When that didn't work, he switched to desperation. I have nowhere to go. I'm your son. Don't you care if I end up on the street? I ignored them all. Then my sister, Laura, called. Why is Kyle calling me, saying he's homeless, she asked. I explained the situation. She sighed. I get it, but, he's family. Maybe just give him a little more time. No, Laura. He had time. He wasted it. She didn't agree, but she didn't push. I had a feeling Kyle was about to learn a hard lesson about how little people are willing to tolerate freeloaders. A week passed before Kyle found someone to take him in. One of his old high school friends, Justin, let him crash on his couch. That lasted 3 days. Justin's mom kicked him out when she realized he wasn't even looking for a job. He bounced around between a few other friends, each time lasting less than a week. Apparently, he had no problem sleeping on people's couches but refused to do something as simple as washing a dish or helping with groceries. And then came the final straw, he called my ex-wife. I hadn't spoken to Kyle's mom, Diane, in years. She left us when Kyle was 6, and apart from a few awkward birthday calls, she was a ghost. But Kyle? He was desperate. One night, my phone rang. It was her. What did you do to our son? She demanded. I almost laughed. Oh, our son. You mean the one you left over a decade ago? She ignored that. Kyle's been staying with me. He told me you threw him out like garbage. I told him to get a job. He refused. Actions have consequences. He's 22, he's still figuring things out. Then he can figure them out without my money. She kept arguing, but I wasn't listening. I knew Kyle had fed her some sob story, twisting the truth to make himself the victim. But here's the thing, Diane wasn't known for her patience. She had a short temper and hated responsibility, which is why she bailed in the first place. Kyle had no idea what he had just walked into. It took 1 week before Diane had enough. One night, Kyle called me from an unknown number. I picked up, half expecting more whining. Instead, his voice was shaking. Mom threw me out. I waited. She said I was lazy, that I reminded her too much of you. Now, that stung a little, but I let it slide. So now what? I asked. Kyle sighed. I don't know. Can I come home? I took a deep breath. Are you working? Silence. Kyle. No, but I'm trying. Trying isn't working. He groaned. Dad, please. I almost felt bad. Almost. But I knew if I caved now, nothing would change. Figure it out, Kyle. I hung up. For the first time in his life, Kyle was completely on his own. And I had a feeling this was about to get worse before it got better. A week passed, then another. Kyle stopped calling. No texts, no voicemails. Silence. I figured he had finally found a job or at least another friend willing to take him in. Maybe he was learning his lesson. Then, one night, at 2 a.m., there was a loud knock on my door. Not a normal knock. A pounding. I got up, checked the peephole, and there he was. Kyle. But something was different. He looked rough. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and for the first time in his life, he actually looked tired. I opened the door but didn't let him in. What do you want? Kyle hesitated, then mumbled, I need to crash here for a bit. Are you working? He clenched his jaw. No, but, I started to close the door. Wait, he yelled. I stopped. I was staying at a motel, okay, he blurted out. I ran out of money. I tried getting a job, but no one's hiring me because I have no experience. Dad, please. Just for a couple of days. For a moment, I considered it. Then I smelled something. It wasn't alcohol. It wasn't weed. It was sweat. Kyle had never smelled like sweat a day in his life. He had always been lazy, but never dirty. Kyle, when was the last time you showered? I asked. He shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. A few days. That's when it hit me. My son, the kid who once refused to put his dishes in the sink, was now homeless. I stepped outside and crossed my arms. Tell me everything. Kyle sighed and rubbed his face. I used what I had left to get a cheap motel room. Thought I'd find a job quick, but no one's hiring. So what happened? Ran out of money. They kicked me out this morning. I nodded slowly. Where have you been sleeping? Kyle hesitated. My car. Now, this was a reality check. Kyle had always acted like he was too good for regular jobs. But now, he was too broke to afford a shower. I could have let him in right then. But something was nagging at me. Why didn't you call? Kyle looked at the ground. Because I knew you wouldn't let me back unless I had a job. Good. At least he finally understood that much. All right, I said. You can come in, his eyes lit up. But you have 48 hours to get a job. Any job. Otherwise, you're out again. He swallowed hard, then nodded. I stepped aside. For the first time in months, Kyle was back home. But this time, I wasn't making it easy for him. The next morning, I woke Kyle up at 6 a.m. Get up. You're going job hunting. He groaned. Can't I just sleep a little? No. I handed him a list of places nearby that were hiring, fast food joints, gas stations, warehouses. No excuses. By noon, Kyle came back, looking miserable. Nobody's hiring. I raised an eyebrow. Really? Because I just checked, and that warehouse down the street is desperate for workers. Walk-ins welcome. His face twisted in frustration. Dad, that job is brutal. So. He clenched his fists, then sighed. Fine. And just like that, Kyle finally, got his first real job. For the next few weeks, Kyle dragged himself to work. He hated it. The hours were long, the pay was low, and the work was exhausting. He came home every day sore, covered in sweat, barely able to move. One night, he dropped onto the couch and groaned. This is hell, he muttered. I shrugged. Welcome to real life. Kyle didn't argue. But then, things took a turn. One night, I got a call. From his job. The manager, some guy named Rick, sounded pissed. Your son just walked out in the middle of his shift. I gripped the phone. What? Yeah. One of my guys yelled at him for being slow, and he just left. Didn't even clock out. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Thanks for letting me know. Kyle wasn't home yet, but I knew where he was. I drove straight to the gas station near our house and sure enough, there he was, sitting outside, scrolling on his phone like nothing had happened. I pulled up, rolled down the window. Get in. He looked up. I was just about to, now. He got in, and we drove home in silence. The second we walked inside, I turned to him. What the hell happened? Kyle slumped onto the couch. The job sucked. My boss was a dick. The guys there treated me like garbage. So I left. I stared at him. You walked out. Without notice? Yeah. So what? That was it. That was the moment I realized he hadn't changed. The struggle, the homelessness, the humiliation, none of it was enough. Kyle still thought the world should cater to him. I took a deep breath, then spoke as calmly as I could. Kyle, you have until morning to figure out where you're going next. Because you're done here. His eyes widened. Wait, what? You heard me. You don't get to quit a job without a backup plan and expect to live under my roof. He looked at me like I had just stabbed him. You're really kicking me out again? No, Kyle. You did that to yourself. For the first time, I saw real fear in his face. But I wasn't done yet. And this time, he had nowhere left to run. Kyle didn't believe me at first. You're serious, he scoffed, shifting on the couch. You're really throwing me out, again. I crossed my arms. I didn't throw you out the first time. You refused to work, so you left me no choice. And now? You quit a job because you didn't like being told what to do. What do you expect me to do? Kyle's face twisted in frustration. I thought you wanted me to have a real job, not work in some shitty warehouse forever. I wanted you to take any job so you could survive. I was surviving, he snapped. I was working, wasn't I? Until you quit. Without a backup plan. Again. His jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists. You don't get it. You've never had people treat you like garbage just because you're new, just because you're not as fast as they want. you think I never had a bad job? I cut in. I worked at a factory when I was your age, Kyle. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, because I had to. You think I had the luxury of walking out? He swallowed hard. That's not the same. It's exactly the same. The difference is, I didn't quit just because I didn't like it. Kyle shook his head, standing up. You don't understand how hard it is for people my age now. Everything's expensive, no one wants to pay a decent wage, that's life, Kyle. My voice came out louder than I intended, but I didn't care. You think this is just your problem? You think every single person working a crap job loves it? No one owes you a comfortable life. If you don't work, you don't eat. If you don't pay rent, you don't get a place to live. That's how the world works. And the sooner you get that through your head, the better. He turned away, hands in his hair, muttering something under his breath. What was that? I asked. He spun back around, his face red with anger. I said maybe Mom was right to leave. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. The room went silent. Kyle's chest was heaving, his hands shaking, but the second the words were out, his face changed. He knew he had crossed the line. I took a step closer. Say that again. His lips parted, but nothing came out. He looked away. Go on, Kyle. Say it. I didn't mean, yes, you did. You meant every word. So say it again. He stayed silent. I exhaled, shaking my head. You think I wanted this? I asked. You think I enjoyed watching you fail over and over, hoping that maybe, just maybe, you'd wake up and do something with your life? Kyle sank back onto the couch, rubbing his face. He looked defeated. I don't know what to do, Dad, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, he didn't sound angry. He sounded lost. And for the first time, I saw the truth, Kyle wasn't just lazy. He was scared. I sat down across from him, my voice quieter now. Why did you really quit? Kyle didn't answer at first. Then, finally, because I felt useless. I frowned. Every day, I messed something up. Every time, someone was on my ass, telling me I wasn't doing it fast enough, good enough, right enough. I tried, Dad. I really did. But no matter what, I felt like I wasn't getting better. Like I wasn't enough. He let out a shaky breath, his eyes fixed on the floor. And I was scared, he admitted. Scared that if this is what life is, if this is all there is, then maybe I just don't have what it takes. The weight of his words settled between us. I had spent so long being angry at him. Angry that he was lazy, entitled, irresponsible. But I had never once considered that maybe, deep down, he was just terrified of failing. Because failing at work. That was one thing. But failing as a person? That's a whole different kind of fear. I let out a breath. You do have what it takes. But no one's going to hand it to you, Kyle. You have to prove it, to yourself and everyone else. Kyle wiped his face, nodded once. So what now, he asked. I stood up. Tomorrow morning, you go back to that warehouse and tell them you want your job back. You apologize for walking out. You take whatever shift they give you. And you stick with it. Kyle looked unsure. And if they don't take me back? Then you go to the next place. And the next. Until someone hires you. He took a deep breath, then nodded. All right. I'll do it. Kyle did go back to the warehouse the next day. His boss chewed him out but let him return. For weeks, I watched him drag himself home, exhausted and sore, but he never quit again. He started saving money. He started talking about moving into his own place. And one day, he walked into the living room, holding a piece of paper. Dad. I enrolled in night classes. I stared at him. You're going back to school. He nodded. I don't want to do warehouse work forever. But I know I have to start somewhere. For the first time in a long time, I felt something other than frustration. I felt proud. It took everything to get to this point. The fights, the failures, the ugly truths. But Kyle finally understood what I had been trying to teach him all along: no one owes you anything. If you want a life worth living, you have to build it yourself. I won't pretend things are perfect now. He still has a long way to go. But at least now, he's finally walking the right path.